Hi, my name is Ryan Beaver, and this is my intervention into LGBTQ discourse. For this assignment, I decided to go with a vlog in response to a video that I saw on YouTube. My audience for this video is specifically the doctor in that video that gave her opinion, and any other individuals who aren't educated on transgender or gender identity, or any cisgender people who don't understand gender identities, or non-binary individuals. And I hope to educate them as to why being trans is not harmful, and it's not confusing, and it's legitimate. Specifically, I was responding to a video posted on YouTube. It was taken from a newscast done by Fox News, and they featured a doctor named Dr. Michelle Cretella, and she equated teaching kids about being trans to child abuse, because she says that sex is hardwired since before birth, and that it's not something that can change after you're born. And she also said that teaching children about transgender ideologies disrupts their normal psychological development, and even went as far as to say that gender reassignment surgery is genital mutilation. And I really wanted to respond to her opinions, because I found it honestly quite shocking that a doctor would give that kind of opinion, because we do know that being trans and non-binary can be explained by science, and even using genital mutilation in her description is quite offensive, because of a lot of third world countries and other communities who do participate in female genital mutilation, and that's something that is harmful and should be taken seriously. And being trans and getting gender reassignment surgery is not the same at all. So I wanted to get into a little bit why I'm addressing this doctor and potentially transphobic people in general. And I wanted to address it because a lot of misinformation causes people to unjustly discriminate against transgender individuals. And being trans can be explained through science. And us teaching kids about what it means to be transgender isn't going to make them trans if they aren't trans. It's just going to give them the vocabulary to discuss what they're experiencing, because just because they can't describe their gendered experience doesn't mean that's not how they experience it. I'd like to educate people, because I want them to know that being trans is not being confused. And I'd also like them to know that being trans is more than just how you feel. It has to do with your chromosomes, your hormones, pheromones, brain chemistry, all types of things like that. That all can explain why somebody does perceive gender the way they do. And even if they are given a specific sex before birth, that doesn't necessarily mean that their gender identity aligns with the reproductive organs they were born with. And I'd also just like to educate people that teaching children about this doesn't make them trans. It just makes them more accepting and understanding, and overall more educated. One of the claims that I wanted to get into was that we should be teaching children about gender identities, and that making them aware of gender identities is not harmful nor confusing. That was like a main point that was talked about in the video that I'm responding to. Just relentlessly explaining why it's child abuse, why it's harmful, why it's confusing. And it's important to know that, like, people are born trans. It's not something that you get convinced into. And this is an important topic to me, because I identify as queer or pansexual. And when I was younger, I wasn't taught about the different sexualities, and I wasn't told how people identified. So I was honestly really confused through dating and my attractions to men and women, and if I was told what it meant to be queer or pansexual earlier on, I think that I would have felt more accepting of myself and my attractions to people. And it's not the same as being trans, but it's similar because I don't identify as being pansexual because I was told what it was when I was younger. I identify as it because I am. And if I was told younger, that wouldn't have made me feel queer. It probably would have just made me feel validated. And I don't think that any of my straight friends or family felt like they needed to identify as gay because they were told what being gay was. And that's kind of the same argument that people are using with transgender individuals. They're saying that if you tell kids what it means to be trans, then they'll be confused growing up, and I just don't agree with that, neither does science. The media that supports these claims against that doctor, pretty much everything we learned in class does go against what the doctor was saying. I think one of the most relevant pieces of media that we observed from class that relates to it would be the Netflix series Pose. And it's extremely relevant to transgender discourse because the show's main characters are primarily transgender women of color or gay males that are homosexual. And the trans characters found themselves in the house and ballroom culture because they were ostracized from normal society. And this shows that them knowing that they were trans didn't change them. It just helped them find a community, because if their families were more accepting, I don't think that they would have to go and find these houses of people like them. But because they were ostracized, identifying as trans made them feel like they had a community, they had support, they felt validated. And I really liked that show as an example for normalizing the LGBT community, because I feel like it's very marginalized in normal media. Another piece of media that we got to look at in class was a video given by Judith Butler, and it was about how your behavior creates your gender. And I thought that this media was really relevant because your gender is performative, basically, and it's nothing more than a role you take on in society. It's not an internal reality, as most people think, but it's a phenomenon that is constantly reoccurring as people perform their gender every day. They perform their gender in different ways. I perform my gender differently than another woman would, and I feel like that's something that often gets overlooked because we put people into binary categories of male and female, and we often forget that they don't necessarily have to be fully female identifying or fully male identifying to be a man or a woman, or to feel like they experience life that way. A little bit more about the video was in relating to what the doctor's statements were, is it's not harmful to children because performing your gender in different ways can't be harmful. The only reason it's harmful is if people are prejudiced in society. And the doctor, she would make it harder to be trans because she is prejudiced against transgender individuals. But that's the only harmful aspect that I can see from what I've been reading and the media that we've been looking at. Another piece of media that we got to look at in class was the TED Talk given by Ronald Murray, and it was called The Language of Ballroom Culture. And he basically explained what house and ballroom was, why it was created, why it was so important to the LGBTQ community. And this relates to my claim, because being trans is not harmful. There are communities for transgender individuals, and if we were more accepting as a society, there wouldn't be any problem with being trans. The only hardships they face are just being ostracized, the depression, the suicidal thoughts from never feeling good enough, from not passing as their gender that they identify with. That's what's harmful. It's not telling them what being trans is, it's the discrimination that transgender people face in our society. And I think that that's really important to note, because I think a lot of the doctors and people who give their opinions on trans individuals, they don't understand that in their own communities, transgender individuals are normal and they are respected and they're treated well. For the outside media, I really enjoyed like looking up different sources and getting more facts about how we can explain being trans to people who may be prejudiced or who may think that science disproves it when that's not the case. There was an article that I looked at, and it was based off of a YouTube video posted by Gigi Gorgeous, and her video was The Science That Explains Transgender, and this is something that I focused on in one of my gender anthropology classes when we learned about intersex individuals. Because people are told that your gender is your chromosomes, if you're XX or XY, but a lot of people don't know that there are more naturally occurring chromosomal makeups than just XX and XY. There's XXX, and there's just other ones that would qualify you as being intersex. And being intersex and being transgender are not necessarily the same thing, but learning about intersex can help someone understand what it means to be trans, because we associate your gender identity with your reproductive organs. And when you look at transgender individuals, you will see that they can have a penis and a vagina, they can have neither, both, just all sorts of different variations, but they still experience a gender. They either feel like they're a man, a woman, or they can experience their life as being non-binary. And that's helpful to explain transgender to people, because you don't just have to act like what your reproductive organs are. And that's what this video talks about, that was discussed in the article. It explains that sexual differentiation in the brain is different than chromosomal processes, and that means that when you experience your gender, like you can tell in a person's brain who's transgender, you can tell what gender they experience in the lobes of their brain, more so than you can with their reproductive organs, which is what we usually use to identify a person's gender. Another source that I looked at was a Planned Parenthood forum, and it was talking about how do you talk to a preschooler about gender identity, and I thought that this was really important to bring up to refute Dr. Michelle's points, because she explained that it's harmful to children, it's mutilating children, it's confusing to children, but the Planned Parenthood article helped explain that children experience gender and being transgender whether you give them the vocabulary or not, and that children start to identify with their gender around age 3, so they need to know the vocabulary to explain how they're feeling, what gender they feel like they identify with, if they don't identify with the gender they were assigned at birth. And it's based off of the claim that trans ideologies are harmful is based off of the assumption that children aren't trans, which we know not to be true. They think that they can trace it as early to like 3 years old. So you're not confusing children, you're just giving them more vocabulary. Another source that I liked was the Human Rights Campaign organization, and they had an article titled Transgender Children and Youth, Understanding the Basics. And this is relevant because it explains that trans children typically are insistent, consistent, and persistent about being transgender, and that just playing with trucks if you're a girl or Barbies when you're a boy, that doesn't mean that you're trans. Trans children are typically very insistent about how they identify. They always feel that way. They bring it up consistently, and it's not something that's getting spoon-fed to them. It's something that they feel. And I think that it's important to refute the doctor's points, because if these children are insistent that they are trans and that's what they feel, if you deny them their right to live as the gender that they feel they are, they will develop severe mental health issues, suicidal thoughts, depression, gender dysmorphia, all types of things that are so much more harmful than educating them. And yeah, that's pretty much all I wanted to talk about for this video. I hope that I was able to explain why I think that transgender education is important, why gender identity education is important. I hope that the doctor who gave her opinion in the video, I hope that she can educate herself and become more open-minded and maybe give less of her own personal opinion and look more on the science side, which is what she originally tried to argue, because a lot of the points that she made about it being scientific was her equating gender to sex, and we know that gender and sex are two different things. Gender is performative, it's how you act, it's masculine or feminine things you identify with, and your sex is your chromosomes, your reproductive organs, it's the anatomy. And sometimes anatomy does not match up with your mind, and that's what being trans is, and that's why we need to validate transgender kids, because they shouldn't have to go through their entire adolescence up until adulthood being confused. They should feel validated. And yeah, hope that helps.